Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Sync Your Life podcast. I have a new friend with me today who I'm excited to introduce you guys to. I think you're going to find a lot of value in her story and what she has to say and everything that she does when it comes to serving people. I know for me, this is something that this topic that we're going to get into today, this idea of trauma and how it relates to our identity and how it really impacts our lives and it impacts all of our lives, is something that we've touched on here on the podcast, but never to the degree that we're going to touch on it today, I have a feeling. So first of all, let me just welcome our guest. Her name is Natalia Rachel. She's from Singapore. So right now, as we do this interview, it is evening for me. It is morning for her. So she's just bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Looks like she's ready to rock and roll the day. Meanwhile, my girls just went to bed and it's evening for me. But we are still like so high energy and I'm so excited to talk to her. We had a little pre-call last week where I just wanted to get to know her a little bit. And I didn't want that call to end. So it was like a 15-minute phone call that was not long enough. So I think it's just going to be perfect for us to really dive in even more deep, I guess, on a deeper level this week on this podcast for everyone to hear. So Natalia, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, sort of how you got to where you are and what you do.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenny. My name's Natalia Rachel. I'm the founder of Illuma Health, and I'm a therapist, a facilitator, consultant, and a writer and a speaker. And the topic that I'm really focused on is healing from trauma and supporting us all, myself included, to move towards a way of existing and relating that brings a sense of peace and power in our lives. And I think that's what we're all really looking for right now. What brought me to work in this field is my own journey recovering from trauma. So I grew up in an abusive environment, both physical and emotional. And, in a very small nutshell, it led me to mental health misdiagnosis, and it led me to a physical illness that spanned over a decade where it affected every system in my body. And I was told, you're not going to make it, you'll be dead before you're 40. And I literally looked everywhere because I had such a strong will and desire to be here and for it to be different. So my entire life, I kind of was searching for answers, wondering what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why is the world like this? Why can I not feel a different way and feel better? And I guess looking through mainstream health and mental health, complementary health, spirituality, all of it, nothing truly shifted for me until I considered myself through the lens of trauma, until I started exploring somatics and coming home to my body. And then I got better. And the doctors couldn't understand how I made this, miraculous recovery. And it wasn't miraculous at all. It's just that I went back to heal all those difficult things that happened to me and learned how to cultivate a sense of safety and find a different way to do it here. And, I'm still going with my own journey.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting to me because for whatever reason, probably divine intervention, this subject of trauma keeps coming up for me, whether it's through interviews for this podcast or just people that I'm running into and meeting in my life. I actually just spoke with someone else yesterday who's a trauma-informed therapist, and it just was like, oh my gosh, here it is again, right? It just keeps coming up. So what I want to do just from the start of this show is to really just let people know, before you say, oh, well, this doesn't affect me, maybe you think that, perhaps there hasn't been abuse in your background or gun violence or anything that's sort of what we would seem to be sort of in the media as traumatic, right? But I want you to sort of address, like, what is trauma to you? How would you define it? And what do you see people when, experiencing when they deal with it?
So the way I define trauma is when a past experience of threat that is over now is living and breathing inside us, and it's affecting the way that we experience and relate in the world. So it might affect us physically, mentally, emotionally, or relationally. And so many of us have had experiences of trauma. And I think it's really important to understand that the trauma is not the event itself. So it's not the gun violence, it's not the abusive mother, it's how it decontextualizes within us when it's left unhealed. And the way trauma shows up inside us is dependent on a number of factors, including our physical baseline at the time of the event and after the event, our mental and emotional health baseline at the time and after the event, and the quality of our supportive relationships at the time of and after the event. And that third one, the relational piece, is probably the most important. So for example, if we go through something really horrendous in our life, whether it's as a child or whether it's as an adult, and we have people there to hold space for us where we can tell our stories and show up authentically with all our messy, glorious emotions, then it's probably not going to become trauma. It's going to be something bad that happened to us that we survived through and that we healed from. Whereas when we are not able to share and to find a way to regulate our experiences through and beyond it, that's when it becomes trauma later on. And it starts showing up in all these very subtle and sneaky ways, whether it's through physical symptoms in the body, whether it's through the fragmented chatter in our mind, or whether it's through the way we're relating. And again, the relational piece is where I often see it showing up the most. A lot of the way we tend to relate is through our traumatized selves and from parts of ourselves that did not get to express authentically during time of trauma. Does that answer your question?
It does, but it brings up a whole lot of other questions. So let me see if I can, let me pick the one that comes to the top of my mind, which is, you know, I want to hear more about this relationship aspect of trauma. You know, I don't know if I should just leave it open-ended like that or to dive deeper into saying, this is interesting to me. This is the first I've heard of this. To me, it's, you know, I've always considered trauma in my mind. And of course, I'm not an expert, but I've always considered it to be, some, you know, an experience that happened to you or something that I heard it referred to recently as something that causes the brain to relive the experience later in a negative way. So this sort of thing that people can keep returning to, right? Because it's not necessarily something that was a positive experience. So I'd love to hear, you know, from your perspective, like tell us more about this relationship side and what, you know, what should be there in the healing journey from a relationship perspective.
So let's bring the conversation directly to relational trauma. So there are many different kinds of trauma, but a lot of trauma is relational. So the harm is occurred within the context of a relationship dynamic. So it might be that something has happened in your family dynamics early on with your mother, your father, your siblings. It might be that something's happened in the context of community or culture, or it might be that later in life, again, the traumatic experience is in relation to a human and the dynamic that is happening between it. So when relationship is the root of the trauma, it is also the crucible for healing. So when we consider trauma healing, we always want to look to the root. And once we understand this important relational piece, it brings a whole different way to our process of healing. So rather than try and fix ourselves, we understand that a lot of our healing happens in dynamic. Now, not all of it. We are responsible for our healing, and there's so much we can do to look after ourselves. But when we have experienced either oppression or harm or neglect or betrayal within a dynamic, which are often the various roots of the relational trauma, usually that starts showing up in the way we relate in the world. Either we are hell-bent on replaying it, or we are so unconsciously or consciously scared of that happening again that we run so far in the other direction and we put on all of these protective mechanisms to keep ourselves safe, but they actually cause us to lose authenticity, to be someone that we're not, and also to unconsciously register other people as threatening. And then that informs the way we relate. And it blocks us from what we all truly want, which is safe, authentic human connection or intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know that when we had a previous conversation, you talked about you know, your experience uniquely in your own healing journey. I'd love to hear about that, because I think it's, you know, when we can hear examples and we can hear what people have gone through and how they've healed, it can maybe help us come to grips with things too.
Sure. Well, you know, it's ongoing, and I think my exploration of relational healing will continue to be ongoing. And while physically and mentally, emotionally, it was quite quick for me to sort of recover and find equilibrium, the relational piece has taken a lot longer. So again, it's really complex because I experienced both physical and emotional abuse from both of my parents. And so those relationships are formative. So they set up the dynamics for me. And some of the relational sort of rules or organizing principles I learned was that I better be watching out for what other people are experiencing and do everything that I could to minimize harm. So I ended up being very hypervigilant, and I was a people pleaser, which is a really common thing in trauma language. We call it fawning. So I would be very careful to make sure that the way I was relating was a way that would make other people happy and keep the peace. I also became desperate for scraps of love and attention and affection. When you have this dynamic growing up, there's no ability to belong, and we need love. We need human connection biologically, neurophysiologically, mentally, emotionally. So as a young child who's not getting that, you learn, well, I need to twist myself in knots. I need to be this human pretzel and become the kind of person that can get it. And I also need to learn to be satisfied with way less than I actually deserve. So all of these things became the unconscious organizing principles of my relational self. And so as I grew up, I learned to behave in ways that would get this sort of sense of safety, keep peace, provide me a sense of belonging. And I would have to abandon myself. And I think self-abandonment is like the disease of our generation. Most of us have learned these things. And so we end up not having good boundaries, not being able to tune into our signals that tell us something's helpful, something's harmful. And we disown ourselves, we abandon ourselves in the name of safety and belonging. And so for me and for many of my clients, a huge part of healing is learning to put boundaries before belonging and learning to tune into, well, what nourishes me and what feels good for me? And can I choose that over a connection that might not be serving me so well or bringing peace or joy into my life? And trust me, I'm still going on this one. I think learning to relate and to give and receive love well is the biggest part of healing, if not the entire point of life.
Yeah, you just said the phrase boundaries before belonging. I want to dive into that for a minute because I recently attended the Tony Robbins Unleash the Power Within. And in that event, he's kind of known for his first activity that he does at the event is he asks you a really profound question, which is, which parent did you crave love from the most? And he goes into sort of a little dialogue about, typically the parent that we crave love from the most is typically has most likely set us up with these sort of expectations or these rules that we now live by. And it was such a profound question for me, and I know for others that I attended the event with, because it was like, gosh, I know for me, I can speak for myself. Like I had one parent that, I had two loving parents. I had a great childhood, but I had one parent that was very affectionate and very, I like to say like words of affirmation, right? There was a lot of verbal praise and love and outward affection. Whereas the other parent, there were always high expectations, right? There was always this sort of, oh, an A minus, like, well, what's the minus for? Like there was always sort of this extra standard. And it's interesting because I've seen this pattern of, I wouldn't call it people pleasing, but just really high expectations for myself throughout my life. Almost like I don't want anyone else to pressure me because I'm already putting so much pressure on myself. Right. And so I see this in my own story. And then a woman that I was with at the event had a really emotional moment over it because she was like, I've never really thought about this before, but it has really shaped so much of who I am and who I've become. So you just said the phrase boundaries before belonging. And if I had to summarize one area of personal growth for myself that I think that I need to work more at, it would be boundaries. And so I would love to hear from you, let's talk about that more specifically and what type of tangible things or what types of tips, I guess, would you give for someone who might find themselves in that situation where they're like, gosh, I'm sort of living by these rules that I was either raised with or somebody else's expectations of me. I always think about that top regrets of the dying is that people feel like they pleased everyone else besides, instead of living the life that they wanted to live. So talk to us more, I guess, about boundaries.
Yeah, I think boundaries is the central thing that we all need to learn, and they change everything. So if we bring it to a very simple concept, boundaries are what separate us from not us. And we need them so that we can live within our capacity. And we've all got a certain amount of capacity to exist and to relate in this world. And our capacity will change over time, depending on so many factors. So the last couple of years through the pandemic, most of us have had reduced capacity. If we've got a big project going on at work, or we're starting a new relationship, anything that takes more time, attention, and energy, it's going to mean that our capacity is reduced. And so firstly, if we learn to understand and honor what our capacity is, a lot will change. The next is learning to set that boundary and say, well, no, this doesn't work for me. This takes me either beyond my capacity, or it violates my sense of well-being in some way. And this is a really big piece, because most of us have learned it's not okay to put that boundary in place. And it could come from a few different scenarios. It could come from, we've learned through our family that it's not okay, that in order to be a good girl or a good boy, or to receive the love, or to make sure no one's going to hurt us, that we have to not have a boundary. We have to make sure other people are okay. Or like in your case, we might have learned that to be valid and worthy, we have to push, push, push and excel and go and get that other 5%, which actually takes us beyond what is really safe and doable for us. So we learn to ignore our capacity and push beyond it. And it can actually also come through culture and religion too. So there are teachings that say, in order to be a good human or to be loved by God or spirit, we have to be serving others, even if that means that we become depleted. So we put the sense of belonging and love and approval above boundaries. And a big part of healing is to learn, well, actually, I need to make sure that I'm safe in myself first. And if there are these people or communities or deities that damn me or reject me or shame me for doing that, then actually these people or systems or concepts aren't really supporting me to be my best self. And I need to choose me.
Wow, that's a powerful thing. I just heard today, I was listening to a podcast by Brendan Burchard. He's got these awesome little 10 or 15 minute podcasts that he puts out a couple times a week. And I don't even know, I think it just sort of rolled into this one. I didn't select it. It just started playing while I was in my car. And it was all about how to diffuse an argument with someone in the middle of an argument. And his recommendation was that when the argument starts, to stop and pause yourself and say, and to remind yourself that the person you're arguing with has experienced trauma. And it was so interesting because he was like, this person that you're having an argument with over whatever it is, right? Like coffee or whatever, it could be anything dumb. It could be something, not necessarily super important. But he said, when you're in that moment, he's like, I want you to remember that they are most likely not, that the argument isn't about what you think it's about, right? That they're coming into that conversation or that argument with something that happened to them in elementary school or something that happened to them in high school that made them feel insecure or unsafe. And because of that, they're fighting back, or maybe it's you, right? Or it's vice versa. Like the two of you are having this differing experience that has led to this argument, when in reality, if you can pause and say, okay, like I'm bringing my trauma into this argument, they're bringing this trauma into their argument. Like this is, having that awareness can really help diffuse the argument itself. We've talked about this idea of safety, and I'd love to hear, when I think of it, I think of, obviously the brain wants to live in a state of safety. So can you talk to us about that? Like how do you define safety in these terms, and what are the parameters for that?
When we're experiencing safety, we experience a sense of all is well. If we have unresolved trauma, it's really unlikely that is being experienced inside us by our nervous system. So the primary question our nervous system is asking all the time in every microsecond is, am I experiencing safety or am I experiencing danger? And in the case of trauma and in the case of threat and survival, the nervous system is experiencing danger, or it's regularly being triggered and going to this place of danger. And what our survival responses do is they try and find a way for us to increase our sense of safety and reduce the sense of danger. And so that often comes out in many different ways. And again, in terms of the relational piece, it might come out as picking a fight, or trying to gain power in a situation where we might feel disempowered. Or on the other hand, it might come out in completely shutting down and disconnecting or ghosting somebody. So the way that we will safety seek will be very different, again, based on these very complex organizing principles that we have. And depending on our very unique map for trauma, the way we need to experience a sense of safety might be different. So some of us may be able to regain a sense of safety only in our aloneness. Some of us may need another person to help us do what's called co-regulate. So if we don't have the capacity inside us, mentally, emotionally, neurophysiologically, to feel safe, we will need another person to help us. Some people need a lot of quiet in order to find it, whereas some people need to be in action and motion. And then on the other hand, some people might find safety through order, whereas some people need to find safety through disruption. So learning our map to safety is really important, not only to help ourselves, but in terms of relationship dynamics. So if you know your partner or your child or your friend's map to safety, then you can engage in a way that is really supportive of their healing in the moment and also in the long term. And I have an article called this on my website. It's called Relationship Maps to Safety. And I think this is more important than love languages. Before we can, really love and do all these beautiful things for each other, we need to help each other feel safe, and we need to help ourselves feel safe too.
Yeah, this is incredible. And, I want to say that I know that when you and I had talked before, and this is something that after you and I hung up that night with our little pre-call, I told my husband about it, and I was like, I can't wait to ask her more about this on the show, because I know that I'm not alone in this experience. But I want to give you an example, I guess, of something that I think relates to this. And this is something that I've struggled with for years. So I was introduced to fitness. Really, I was a high school athlete, but I wouldn't say I was like a top performer by any means. It was more of just a hobby. I was introduced to health and wellness and fitness actually in my 20s through yoga. And my yoga instructor, who also happens to be the same person who referred me to functional medicine and who's been sort of my partner in crime in all this for years, the reason I think I fell in love with yoga was because it was the way that she taught it was such a rigorous practice. It was this hour-long session where it was like, it was really kind of grueling, honestly. Like, it was probably one of the most intense workouts that I had done. And it was a challenge. It was a new challenge. It was not at all touching your toes. It was more about just like breathing with the body and moving with the body. And I'll never forget the first time I ever did yoga. I was so worried that we were going to be like meditating or saying alms. Like, I was so scared of the whole experience. And instead we were constantly moving. And at the end of the hour, she says, okay, we're going to relax into Shavasana, which anyone listening, if you're not into yoga, is corpse pose, which is basically where you lie on your back. And it's sort of a moment of meditation or reflection, or for some people, naps. There's always somebody that falls asleep in class. But for me, it was the most challenging experience of my life. And to this day, this is 13 years later, anytime I'm in that situation where it's like, okay, I've had a rigorous yoga practice and now it's time to relax. Now it's time to lie still. I cannot get my mind to shut off. And so this is something that my friend, Jen, my yoga instructor, she's worked with me on it. She'd be laughing if she heard this right now, because she always jokes. She's like, I always feel like Jenny's eyes are on me in the class. Like, if, when we get to Shavasana, like, I feel like she's wondering, like, how long is this going to be? Is this going to be like 15 minutes? Do I have to lay here for 3 minutes? Like, how long is this going to be? So I had brought this up to you, and I don't remember the context of how we brought it up, but when I said it to you, you said, because you don't feel safe. You said there's a safety issue there. And so it made me think, as somebody who's constantly advocating root cause medicine, root cause for everything, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe the root cause isn't just my struggle with stillness. Maybe there's a reason for that struggle with stillness. So I want to speak to what I would call the perfectionist mama out there, right? Like the woman who is just sort of like, go, go, go all the time, never stops. If stillness is a struggle, I like to say, usually it's what we resist that we need the most, but you can't just keep telling yourself that you need it and then struggle with it. And so to me, this idea of safety helps me at least get to sort of the root cause. So can you help me get to that root cause? Can you tell me like what it is that I'm probably holding on to?
Well, probably not in the context of a short podcast, but I can maybe provide some insight into why it might be happening and what to explore moving forward. I'm sure it's going to be quite a process. So one of our survival responses, as I'm sure you and most people listening would be aware of, is fight or flight. And what can happen if we are busy, go, 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 go all the time, is that our nervous system gets stuck there. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with trauma. It could be, but not everything's trauma. So what's interesting is that our nervous system, and actually every part of us, learns through experience. So if our go-to mode is to be switched on all the time, moving all the time, go, 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 our nervous system will do what's called a recalibration. And it will start to know that that is normal and that that is safe, and that anything else means that something's wrong. And so even if you don't have trauma, but you kind of have been living in this really go, 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 push, push, push mode for a really long time, that's what your nervous system will call home. I'm safe here. And so when you start to come out of that, the nervous system goes, oh, something's wrong. This is not normal. And so that's when a lot of thoughts can come. Some people might get a racing heart. And I call this the trauma paradox. So when we have, and there are many paradoxes when it comes to trauma, but when we have a miscalibrated nervous system, so actually when we're in this go, go, go mode, it's not super healthy for us. Our nervous system is actually experiencing a mild amount of danger or threat or overload. But when we come to know that is safe, and when we come to know rest and peace as dangerous, our wires are crossed. And so a big part of healing that is to first understand that, which we're exploring right now, and then to start to try and repattern that. So something that might be interesting to explore the next time you are in Savasana is to see what would it be like to actually let your body and let your nervous system know it's safe to be here. And can I invite, with this beautiful caring intention, my body to relax onto the floor? Something that often goes along with this is a lot of bracing in the body. So again, I invite you next time you are lying in that position to notice, where am I holding tension? Is it in my shoulders, my neck, my jaw, my hips, my toes? Those are the most common parts. Can I invite them to let go a little bit? And can I make friends with the ground and let it hold me? And the answer might be, actually, yeah, I can pretty easily let go if I care for myself in that way. And when that happens, there can be this softening or releasing, or there can be these twitches that start to come through the nervous system, and they can be really little, or they can be quite big jerks as well. And that is the nervous system coming out of threat. Then if we bring the conversation to trauma, so this is not trauma, it's just we're in fight or flight all the time, and we're bracing and pushing and going, and we need to let ourselves know that we don't need to be doing that all the time. If there is a history of trauma, what can often happen with us in exercise is that we are using exercise as what's known as a defensive accommodation. So we are putting ourselves in a place where we are focused and we are expelling energy, because we then do not need to feel what's really beneath the surface. We don't have to feel our emotions, our pain, our trauma, access those memories. And so if that's the case, when we do come into stillness and when we do create safety for ourselves, that's when a lot of our emotions can come up and memories can come up. But they are only going to come up if our being across every system says, it's safe for me to feel this and to process that now. And so that usually comes either after there's been quite a bit of healing work done already in terms of self-healing, or it comes up within a really safe relationship dynamic, which ties back to what we were talking about earlier. So sometimes we're not able to find the safety on our own to explore, but having somebody there, and in the context of, say, a yoga therapy or a somatic healing process, someone may simply sit with you or put their hand on your shoulders or hold your feet, and that co-regulation, that dynamic, all of a sudden makes it safe for you to come in and to feel. So one of the words you used is discomfort. So it may be safer to sit with that discomfort unfollow it. And if you're working with someone who is really trauma informed, they would be able to help you identify, well, where is that discomfort in my body? What are the sensations, the textures, the colors? What is the emotion or what is the memory that's connected there? And this is called somatic bridging. And when we're able to bridge through our discomfort and through the sensations to the root, that's when we can really start to heal our trauma in a way that it truly integrates.
Yeah, this idea of somatizing is interesting to me. It's something that I've definitely experienced in just learning more about my body, like having more proprioception of my body and how I move through space, and just starting a fitness practice 13 years ago has introduced me to, the ways that I hold tension and the places in my body that I carry tension. I know for me, a lot is in my shoulders. I tend to literally, I'm like the girl whose shoulders go up to her ears, right? As the day goes on, and so, but also like kind of relating back to what you were just saying about that relational component, having an instructor and a friend who sees that in me also helps bring about that awareness. So for her to be able to say, Jenny, is there a reason why, when we're in downward dog, you can't let your head hang? Like, why are you holding onto your head? Right. And I'm like, I'm holding onto my head. Like, you don't even realize it. Right.
Yeah.
But these small things of where you carry tension in the body, or as my instructor would say, like, where are you holding your breath? Like where in your life and in your day-to-day are you holding your breath? This all has such an impact on our nervous system, but also on our hormones, right? So cortisol is your stress hormone. And so for me, when I dealt with something that's known as adrenal fatigue, about 7 or 8 years ago, I found that my cortisol, when my testing came back, my cortisol was actually rock bottom. A lot of people think of cortisol as potentially being something that, when it's high, that tends to be you're stressed out, you have a high stress problem, you need to get it calmed down, right? But what I found actually in the last couple of years of working with a lot of women and their hormone health is a lot of them who are embracing exercise and who are very type A, go, are experiencing the opposite, which is adrenal burnout. They're experiencing cortisol and adrenal fatigue, right? Like this depletion of cortisol. Yeah. So I kind of want to talk about that just in the sense of, I know we aren't necessarily like medical doctors that are talking about this from that angle, but from people who understand sort of the stress response and this idea of fight or flight that people don't necessarily realize, like, yeah, you're not being chased by a tiger day to day, but you are making decisions and you are living out your life in a way that your cortisol is still responding. So what would you say, I guess, to the woman who's listening to this, who, is maybe experiencing that type of stress, and what do you know about this from that angle?
So the nervous system is very closely linked to our hormone health. In fact, the nervous system is the governing system of our body. So when it's out of whack, you can bet that at least one, if not multiple other systems in our body are also going to be affected, and also our mental emotional health is going to be affected. So it's all connected. And what you're describing about the levels of really bottoming out and dropping and going into depletion is usually really commonly connected to either a freeze response or a coactivation in the nervous system. So we're all really aware of fight or flight, which is this go, run, or fight. But what can happen either if the sense of danger is really acute or if it's prolonged over time is that our nervous system switches into a freeze response or a shutdown. And that's when the opposite happens. That's when we start to feel apathetic and exhausted and perhaps depressed or teary. And so that's the nervous system sort of saying, actually, I really need to just hide and curl up under a blanket until this threatening situation passes. But most of us do not give ourselves that, especially if we're type A. We're like, no, I'm not going to do what my nervous system and body wants. I'm going to keep on going. And what usually happens then is the threat response doesn't go away, but we send ourselves into what's called coactivation. So we have two threat responses, either running at once, both a freeze and a fight or flight, or we start flicking between both. And this is a really common experience. 1 minute I'm ready to conquer the world and I'm going to do a million things today. And the next moment I can't get out of bed. I'm so exhausted and I need 4 coffees to even get going. And so that's an indication, that flicking, that we're actually in a coactivated state. And this is the most dangerous because sometimes it's really hard to understand or hard to undo, and it takes quite a lot of healing work. If we just come back to the concept of a freeze, so when we're in a fight or flight state, we need to kind of slow down and deregulate, downregulate. When we're in a state of freeze, actually we want to upregulate and find movement and expression, but it often feels counterintuitive. So when we're experiencing that deep exhaustion, the last thing that we want to do is move, but actually it's moving in a very gentle, slow way that can be really helpful. So practices like yoga are really good for that. Another antidote to freeze is connection. So when our nervous system can't kind of find its way to regulate or to find life, being in connection with somebody that has more of this sense of aliveness or well-being and that we feel safe with can actually ignite our nervous system to wake up. And again, it's often counterintuitive because often when we're in a freeze state, we just feel like we don't want to see anybody. We want to shut down. We don't want anyone to see us like this. We can't be bothered. But it's actually going against that sort of false intuition and moving into nourishing connection that can really kickstart. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you're exhausted at the end of the day and you just feel terrible and you feel like, oh, I really don't want to go to this event or go to this dinner with my friends. And then you show up and you have the best time and you feel better for it. That's an example of how going against that instinct to sort of go into your cave can be super helpful. If we're co-activated, it's way more complex. And I often talk about learning which survival response is on top and working with that. And again, to be able to do that, there needs to be a certain ability to somatize and sense, well, what is most present in my nervous system now? And what can I do to counter that threat response?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think, it makes me think about just, you mentioned down regulation, right? Like how can we experience more peace, so to speak? I mean, if I had $1 for every woman who has come to me with some sort of hormone imbalance concern, and they basically everything that you just said is exactly their experience, right? Like they've spent years going, whether it's with small children or putting everybody else ahead of themselves and sort of ignoring that. I like to say ignoring that check engine light, right? And then there comes a day where they literally are just like, and then it happened. Like I woke up one day and I just couldn't get out of bed. Like, it's like their whole body just shuts down, right? It's like their nervous system literally is like, you have done me in, right? And so I know one thing that I equip women in my course with is a breath workshop, like getting women to really embrace the fact that you control your breathing. And if you can control your breathing, you can really almost control that sort of nervous system downregulation. Are you a fan of certain, types of breathing, or what types of ways do you usually recommend downregulation?
I love breathing, but I also think breathing can be used for so many other things other than downregulation. So downregulation is one tool. So I'm really a big fan of alternate nasal breathing for downregulation, but there are different breathing techniques we can use to enliven our breath or to somatize or to bring awareness and healing to different parts of our body. So I think expanding the conversation around breathing is super important. And I also think it's really important to touch on that sometimes breathing can be harmful. So when somebody's got sort of live trauma in their system that's waiting to come up, to bring the attention to the breath can feel like too much. And so either they feel triggered and re-traumatized, or they completely just shut down and don't engage in the exercise. Because again, that danger signal goes off. It's not safe for me to be here with my breath. So I'm really pro bigger conversations around breath and that trauma-informed piece.
Yeah, and this is something that has come up for me recently. I have a couple of friends who have mentioned their experiences with EMDR therapy, and maybe this is something that's maybe it's off topic. I don't know enough about this to know, but I was listening to something the other day that was talking about the way the person sort of created an analogy was they were talking about that EMDR is a really great way of sort of getting in touch with particular memories that could have been traumatic, and then sort of refiling them in the brain. So this is sort of a new thing for me. This EMDR stuff is something that I've just heard about in the last couple of years, but Is this sort of just another tool? Is EMDR another tool as far as therapy is concerned to really kind of help with trauma for people who've experienced trauma?
So I have not studied this modality, but it is a increasingly well-known and sought out modality, and it's a somatic modality. So again, it's about helping make it safe enough for you to tune in to something that perhaps hasn't been completely processed, and find both a way to discharge and release, and I guess recategorize it. There are many different modalities out there for trauma healing. So EMDR is one, somatic experience is another, somatic experiencing is another, and trauma-informed relational somatics is the modality that I teach. And all of them are different, but what I feel is most important is to be working with a practitioner that is really trauma-informed and that you feel safe with. So rather than picking a modality, how does my nervous system respond to this person? Do I feel safe to share authentically? And do I feel safe to know that if I do become activated, so if I experience heightened sense of emotion in a session with them, do I feel confident that they're going to be able to carry me through that? And so that's what I would be looking for as opposed to a modality, though I am a big fan of looking for therapists that have some kind of somatic approach.
Yeah. This is awesome. And of course, at the very end of this, we will be linking everybody up to your, your personal blog and all of your resources as well. So one thing that came to my mind is I know that we were connecting over the fact that we have children. And I was thinking about, how can we really create more awareness, not only in ourselves of our physical responses to things, or, our day-to-day, I guess you could say, our day-to-day experiences and how we're feeling and the emotions that come up around things that happen, but also like, how do you, I guess, go about creating that sort of awareness in your own children to really pay attention to their emotions? Is there any tricks there?
Well, the first thing is to be regulated within ourselves. So I always say to mummies and daddies that before we can really tune in to our children and teach our children, we have to do it for ourselves. So we are their model. So until age 7, our children's nervous systems are a direct response to ours. And actually, while we are in dynamic, there's always going to be this responsiveness going on. And as the parent, we are more powerful. So we have the dominant nervous system. So the most important thing is when we are engaging with our children to make sure as often as possible that we are regulated. And when we've got little kids or when we're overwhelmed, that can be really tough. We all get overwhelmed. Sometimes we all get grouchy. And one of the first tips that I teach parents is to the moment that you're feeling activated to create a circuit break in your experience. So it might be to say something like, Mummy is feeling overwhelmed at this moment. I'm going to take 2 minutes space. I love you and I'll be back shortly. And some of us might think, oh, well, I shouldn't have to do that. But actually, we're teaching our children not to engage from a place of threat. We're teaching our children that we can look after ourselves, and we're teaching our children to then repair from a place that's going to promote peace. So when my kids were really little, I learned to do that, and it changed everything. When they were really young, I had moments where I would be so overwhelmed that I would yell at them, and I would feel like I hate my kids in that moment. And not many people talk about this, but most mummies have those experiences. But to then engage from a place when we're feeling like that, that's harmful. But to be able to notice, oh my goodness, I'm in overwhelm, I'm in survival, I'm going to regulate so that I can then co-regulate with my child. To me, that is the biggest gift that we can give our children. Then when it comes to supporting them to grow and learn, number one, they're learning to regulate through us. But the second thing is to help them tune into their bodies and let us know what they're feeling. So one of the things that my daughter has is when she's anxious, she'll get a stomach ache. So she's very similar to me. We're both little somatic experiences. So she'll be like, oh, Mummy, I've got a stomach ache. I don't think I can go to school or to the party. And rather than just accept the stomach ache or push her to do it, well, can you tell me about your stomach ache? Can you tune in? So I'll get her to often close her eyes and put her hands on her belly and ask me, like, what are the emotions or thoughts that go with your stomach ache? Actually, I'm really worried about A, B, C, or D. And then we open conversation and she feels seen and she feels heard and she understands herself. So that's probably a really beautiful tool for parents. And the second thing is to be able to promote our kids to speak up when they don't like something and to set boundaries. For our generation, we were taught not to do that. And a really simple example is to allow them to say when they don't want a hug. We're like, come on, give mommy a hug or give grandpa a hug. And actually to be able to empower them to choose whether they want to do something. To me, that's also really profound. And I think that when we parent our kids in these ways, they're going to grow up so differently. They're not going to grow up fragmented. They're not going to grow up needing to go to therapy the way we did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as the mother of two girls, it's interesting because we've had that position that with that unique example, we've had that position from day one of, we're not going to like inform our children that they're hugging a relative or a friend or anybody else. If they want to, they can, but we're certainly not going to ask them to. But also, like, I think too, I have two girls, and I don't know if it's just girls maybe being more high drama than boys, or maybe that's just my own stereotype in my head. But my 5-year-old, from the time she was probably a year old, she's just an internalizer. Like she sees everything happening around her. She sees every little detail. And sometimes you don't even realize like what she sees or interprets. And then later, like in the bathtub, I always like to tell people like the bathtub is like our special time of the night, because that seems to be when everything comes out. That's when she tells me about what happened at preschool and who hit who at preschool. You know what I mean? Like all the things that come out in the bathtub. But it's always interesting to me because I'm always like, oh my gosh, like she is picking up on so much. And so the fact that you just said, that our tone, I guess, is what I take from that. Like our tone, the way we set our tone really sets the tone for our children. And it sort of sets the scene for how they interpret different situations is really powerful. We have to sometimes say, and now I have an 18-month-old, and just in the last 3 days, she mimics the 5-year-old, right? Like she wants to be copycat. So her new thing is she started sulking. And so this is like a new thing, right? And so of course my husband and I are like, this is kind of cute, but we're not going to tell her it's cute, so we're not going to communicate that. But she will literally just like tuck her head like she's upset, right? But of course she's got maybe 10 words in her arsenal, so she's not going to have a conversation with us about what she's feeling. But I noticed this just this evening, my 5-year-old was asking my 1-year-old, she was like, Sutton, are you upset? She was like, are you having big feelings? And she started asking her these questions, and I'm thinking, well, she's getting that from us. She's getting that from her preschool teacher. She's getting, the people that are feeding into her. And so I just was curious, and I'm glad I asked that question, because I think a lot of people listening to this are most likely moms. And, we say the same thing about your health and wellness. The way that you talk to yourself about yourself, your children see that, right? If you're beating yourself up in the mirror over the way you look in a swimsuit, your 5-year-old daughter sees that. Right. And it's the same thing is true for life in general. So I know that you talk about, psychology, neurology, spirituality. I want to talk about spirituality for just a minute and how that plays a role. Can you tell us more about that particular pillar?
Gosh, it's a big topic. So growing up, I never would have considered myself spiritual, but on my healing journey, I started to just come into contact with energy healing and meditation. And, there's a whole world of spirituality. And initially I found it super helpful. I found it really helpful to give me a sense of hope, to find a sense of meaning and purpose, and also to be able to find tools to help me downregulate, and also to be part of communities where I would belong. And so I found it helpful in that respect. And so I started studying and exploring many different energy healing modalities and reading many spiritual texts. But in my journey, I started to notice that there was this link to what we call toxic positivity, where everything was love and light, which didn't feel quite right to me. And then I also started to notice these strange relational dynamics, where it was like certain people would be like Jekyll and Hyde. So there'd be, I'm meditating and I'm here to love you one moment, and the next moment being pretty mean or aggressive or shaming or rejecting other people. So there was all this inconsistency. And so during that early stage of exploring spirituality, I sort of was at the brunt of some of this, and I just realized something's not right here. This isn't love and light. This is like another mask or another facade or another avoidance tactic. And so for a number of years, I really pulled away from spirituality, and I just focused on my healing work and building my former business of clinics here in Singapore, and, honing my craft. And interestingly, I started to have more and more people from that world come to me to seek support, and they were having a similar experience, but in themselves. So their story would be, I've become this person that is love and light and, all these beautiful things, but actually either deep inside, I still feel like something is wrong, or I'm having these emotional outbursts or getting into these really awful dynamics. And so supporting these people to go back and process origins of trauma would be what would then allow them to calibrate. So there's a topic called spiritual bypassing, which I'm a big fan of exploring. So I think spirituality can be really beautiful, and it can bring us a lot of resource and connection and peace, but we have to make sure that we're not running from what's beneath the surface. And so my sort of more recent exploration of spirituality is how to bring it to a place that is really grounded and authentic, where we're accessing all of the beautiful things that it can offer, but we're not ignoring what's really there. So we're not using it as a way to avoid. And I would consider myself a deeply spiritual person. I meditate every day. I have beliefs about life, but it's not something I lead with. So it's not part of my sort of personality from which I interface with the world. And it's not something that I'm using to avoid what's really there. So as with all frameworks, it can be helpful as long as we're just really authentic about what it is and what we're using it for.
Yeah. So what types of tools do you use for meditation? Is it something that you sort of have your own thing for, or are you using, apps or tools? What is your...
So I've been meditating for many years now, so I no longer use apps or anything like that. There are so many different ways to meditate. The most simple meditation that I use when I'm feeling really overwhelmed or just like something's a bit icky or not quite right is I'll lay down and I'll use my breath as a tool. And on my inhale, I'll breathe in what heals and supports me, and I'll exhale what doesn't serve me. And so that is the most simple practice that I used right at the beginning of my meditation journey when I was healing from my illness. And I still use it now when I'm feeling out of whack and out of balance. I also really like active meditation. I use swimming as meditation. And I've also explored shamanic journey meditation, which is really beautiful. So I don't think there's a right way. It's about meeting yourself where you are and being clear, what is the intention? Is the intention to downregulate? Is it to release something? Is it to become more connected to myself? So there are so many tools out there, meditation and beyond, but I always think coming back to my intention, and am I just trying to calm myself down in this moment, or am I trying to go deeper and heal something that's really there for me right now?
Yeah, the word intention is a huge word, right? I think we've used a lot of words on this podcast so far. We've talked about awareness, we've talked about intention, we talked about belonging, healing. I mean, there are so many powerful words that we've touched on just in this short episode. I know that self-abandonment is essentially the problem that you solve. What is your hope for everybody listening to this, that in ridding themselves of that self-abandonment? What is your hope for everyone listening?
I really would love everyone to know and believe that there's nothing wrong with you, and that in the context of trauma and in the context of this crazy world that we're living in, you make perfect sense. So all of those adaptive strategies or personality quirks or experiences that you're having, they're happening within the context of trauma or this world. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. I think most of us feel such a sense of shame and find it so hard to look after ourselves. And the moment we understand that what we're experiencing makes sense, a lot of that shame can dissolve and we can really start to heal.
Well, that's a great way for us to end today, even though I think I could talk to you forever. I know you have the whole day ahead of you. I want people to know that you have a book coming out, which I know I'm excited about. When it releases in August, correct?
Yes, so it releases August 23. It's called Why Am I Like This? Illuminating the Traumatized Self. So I hope you go out and download it or buy it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I can't wait. Yes, I'm definitely going to put it on my calendar. So if people want to hear more from you or seek you out, how can they find you?
So you can head to my website, nataliarachel.com. I'm also really active on LinkedIn and Instagram, and it's at Natalia_Rachel_change.
Perfect. We will link all that up in the show notes so that you guys can have ease of access as you're listening. You can take some time to just search the show notes and click on all those links to make it easy for yourself. So thank you so much, Natalia, for taking your time to meet with us today. This is such a powerful episode that I know that I'll refer back to often, and that I will be sending to my course takers and to everybody who follows me, because I think there is so much here. So thank you so much for taking your time to be with us. And I can't wait to meet you in September. We're going to actually get to meet here in the Midwest in September. You're going to be coming all the way across the world to good old Tennessee. And so I will see you there. But thank you. Yes. Thank you again, my friend. It's been great.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really beautiful session.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.